While the Alliance and NKE were at the brink of war, the people of the Karada Islands declared independence from the UKC after months of protests and formed their own nation, the People's Republic of Karada, or PRK. This would be the first time in history a territory left the Alliance. At first, the Alright Kingdoms Coalition planned to send its fleet to reclaim the islands when its ships returned from the NKE border. But with the eyes of the world now on Karada, many countries, including some in the Alliance, would recognize the PRK as an independent nation. This would put the UKC in a bind, as attacking a foreign nation unprovoked would violate Alliance law. With its own people and the Alliance against starting a war, the UKC would be forced to let go of the Karada Islands, the last part of its colonial empire to fall away. But even with the threat of the UKC attacking the PRK gone, the rest of the Alliance was still concerned over Karada. The economy of the islands had been struggling ever since the advent of the hydrogen jet engine, when it was no longer needed as a refueling stop for rocket-powered ships. Ever since, the people of Karada had depended on their fishing waters. But when the UKC built a naval testing facility on the islands, most of those fishing waters turned into a weapons testing ground. To the islanders, independence was the only way to keep their home. But even now that they were in control, it was unclear if Karada would be able to survive. With the submersible warship now destroyed, and the threat seemingly over, the Alliance could finally continue launching its space missions again. Having used the spare time to reassess its plans, the Alliance had come to the conclusion that it desperately needed a cheaper way of launching its payloads into orbit. Although the Zagonian Starscraper was supposed to have taken over this role from the Atlas SSRT, it could only really launch up to 5 tons into a low Kerbin orbit, a far cry from the 20 tons the Atlas was capable of. And though the Prometheus rocket could launch 20 tons into orbit, it was a lot more expensive. But rather than bringing the Atlas out of retirement, the Alliance would move forward, choosing to build a new spaceplane unlike any other. The Cormorant-class SSTO could bring over 20 tons of payload into low Kerbin orbit and back within its experimental cargo bay, all while costing less than half of what the Atlas did. For its first mission, it would launch 3 new deep space communication satellites, which would wait in low Kerbin orbit for the future launch of a tug vehicle. With its first payload now delivered, the Cormorant would be put through its most important test, surviving re-entry. After a bouncy landing, the Cormorant had proven itself by returning safely to the Alliance Space Center to be reused. The Alliance would immediately begin preparations for the Cormorant's second mission. The remote-controlled tug stage would be used to help bring the new deep space communications satellites to their final orbit. While the Alliance was no stranger to putting together spacecraft in orbit, this would be the first time this specific dual launch technique would be used. Now that the Enterprise and its deep space tanker were heading into deep space, the Alliance would use its new satellites to overhaul their old communications system, so they could receive the faint signals from the Enterprise and its tanker when they finally reached Dres. This new satellite system would not only allow for these deep space transmissions to be received, but also for several deep space missions to take place at once, something that would be vital in the near future. The Alliance would begin a two-part expansion for the Serenity moon base. First, a new connecting module would be launched, which would connect the habitat and command modules. This would dramatically reduce the crew's need to go on EVA when moving about the base. It would also set the precedent for future modules to be added. remote-controlled tug rover would be used to move the new module into place, thereby docking the command and habitat modules. As well as being the first proto-colony, the moon-based Serenity was also a testbed for new technologies. Bringing fuel from Kerbin to the moon was very expensive, and as the moon-based Serenity was expanding, more and more fuel would be needed. Luckily for the Alliance, much of the Serenity crater was rich with large underground ice deposits which could be turned into rocket fuel via electrolysis. As the second part of the moon base's expansion, the new experimental mining module would be the first attempt at producing rocket fuel on another world. If trial runs were successful, it would eventually be a keystone in the Alliance's lunar operations. The future of Serenity Base seemed bright, though, as the Alliance would soon be reminded, they were not the only superpower looking up at the stars. Almost 2 decades ago, when the Egyptian Union and the Alliance were at the brink of war, the Khopesh, the most advanced space warship of its time, detected a strange object coming from deep space, sporadically emitting a light signal as it flew by Midness, before disappearing again into the void. Only the extremely sensitive sensors of the Khopesh could detect it at the time, and nothing else like it had been seen since. Thoth Base, the Empire's Midmas outpost, would search the night sky to help unravel this mystery. Meanwhile, it would also study the planets and moons throughout the Kerbal System, celestial bodies that the Empire might one day visit. A new constellation of satellites would be launched by Periapsis Incorporated, a company that was becoming increasingly wealthy thanks to its satellite services. This new constellation would be placed around the moon rather than Kerbin, and would help alleviate the old Alliance lunar communication system, which was struggling to keep up with demand. Although use of these satellites was eventually meant to be sold to commercial moon bases, it was, at the time, forbidden for companies to place anything on the moon's surface, in order to prevent contamination of the valuable science that was left. But as more and more nations and companies in the Alliance were taking an interest in spaceflight, it was clear that something would have to change. To make sure the science data was impacted as little as possible, commercial activity would be limited to only one biome, and it had to be somewhere with a large amount of natural resources. Only 2 craters on the moon fit the bill. After some debate, the crater where the Serenity moon base was located would be chosen, and there the Alliance would establish the Serenity Economic Zone.